In 1953, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay became the first ever humans to summit Mount Everest. Except they weren't, or at least that's the opinion of some in the climbing community. 23 years earlier, sometime in June 1924, Noel Odell had become fixated on two tiny black dots moving across the top of Mount Everest. It was George Mallory and Andrew Irvine. They were attempting to do what Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay had done. The only difference, though, was that they were doing it over 20 years before Hillary or Norgay had even stepped foot on the mountain. Climbing Mount Everest was never going to be simple, though. Humans need oxygen to survive. It's a well-tested and verified fact at this point. If you don't believe me, hold your breath for a while, and you'll eventually figure it out. But above 8,000 meters, the concentration of oxygen is so low that you're basically dying with every breath. The atmospheric pressure drops to just a third of what it would be at sea level. Spending longer than a day at this altitude, even with additional oxygen, is basically a death sentence. If not being able to breathe doesn't kill you though, there's countless other ways that you can die on Everest. At these heights, winds can reach hurricane speeds, enough to knock any unlucky mountaineer straight off the side of the mountain. Or what about the temperatures? The summit basically never reaches above minus 20 degrees, and at its worst can reach minus 60. And that's before you even factor in wind chill. If worst were to come to worst, you could become nothing more than a non-breathing human icicle flying down the side of the mountain. The best case scenario is that you suffer an incredibly horrific experience all the way to the summit, look around for about 5 minutes, realise that your oxygen is getting low, and then begin an equally as horrific climb down, hoping all along the way that you don't slip, get blown off, or feel so tired that you simply sit down to rest and, well, never get up again. But if you do make it through all that, you do get to brag, which is kinda nice. In the modern day, you can pay roughly $45,000 to have someone guide you to the top, and then you can brag to everyone around you that you climbed the highest peak in the world. But back in the 1920s, bragging about having climbed Everest would have been, well, noteworthy to say the least. In the words of George Mallory, when asked why he wanted to climb Everest, he simply responded, "Because it's there." And honestly, that's as good a reason as any I can come up with. The hardest part of the mountain was probably the final section, known as the 3 steps. 2 of the 3, the first and the third, were somewhat climbable, even for the 1920s mountaineer. But the second step, that was much more difficult. It was almost 40 meters high, and the final 5 meters were basically vertical. The chances of someone managing to find a way through that were slim, especially if they had never seen it before. The 1924 expedition wouldn't be Mallory's first attempt at the mountain though. He had gone on the 1921 and 1922 expeditions to Everest. These were meant to happen in 1915 and 1916, but Europe at the time was undergoing some difficulties that made travel quite difficult. The less said about that, the better. Either way, the 1921 expedition had been somewhat of a success. Its purpose was to find if it was even possible to find a route to the top. And they found what they thought was a path along the North Column and onwards towards the summit. The 1922 expedition would be the first actual attempt at summiting. This time, they would use bottled oxygen to assist them, a first in the world of mountaineering. Although how useful these bottles were is debatable. They were often faulty and filled with low-quality oxygen. But as the men got higher and higher, the need for that additional source of oxygen very quickly became, well, non-optional, no matter how much extra weight that the bottles added. The first attempt without oxygen was made by Mallory, Somerville, Norton and Morshed. They would manage to make it all the way to 8,225 meters, around 600 meters short of the summit, and in the process set a new world record for the time, before eventually having to turn back. The second attempt would be made with oxygen, this time by George Ingle Finch, Jeffrey Bruce, and the Gurkha soldier Tejber Burra. Another pronunciation butchered, but surprise surprise, the use of bottled oxygen made a world of difference to the men's climb. They again managed to break the world height record set the previous day, reaching 8,326 meters, before their oxygen system started to have problems and forced them to turn back. Mallory and several others, upon hearing about their incredible climb with the oxygen, was desperate to have one last go at the mountain himself, this time with the aid of the bottled oxygen. They set off with 14 porters in tow. However, this third attempt would end abruptly when their movements would trigger an avalanche. This avalanche would bury several of the porters and kill 6 of them. The expedition for that year ended basically immediately. But seemingly the sight of seeing many of his comrades buried underneath snow, experiencing the freezing temperatures and the unstable rock face, just simply wasn't enough to put Mallory off returning to the mountain. Instead, it only seemed to embolden him and encourage him further, like some kind of weird desire for punishment. He would be back for the 1924 expedition, and this time he was going to reach the summit. Or at least, that's what his intention was. 12 men would be participating in the 1924 expedition, including George Mallory and Andrew Sandy Irvine. Irvine was a new member of the team, and mostly served as a test of how younger people could handle the slopes of Everest. By the 21st of May 1924, all the intermediate camps from Camp 1 at 5,400 metres on the East Rungbuk Glacier to Camp 4 at 7,000 metres on the North Column would be set up. In total, the camps would require 150 porters working constantly to supply them. Everyone did eventually make it to Camp 1 in, well, one piece, and just a little bit worse for wear. But with everything now finally set up, all that was left to do was picking which of the porters to join the 12, and then head to the summit, and hopefully make it there and back, or at least closer than they did during the last expedition. The first attempt at the summit would be undertaken by Mallory and Charles Bruce, the expedition's leader. They would be supported by 9 porters to carry supplies. However, before they had even managed to set up Camp 5, 4 of the porters, perhaps wisely, realizing that they were over halfway up the side of one of the most dangerous mountains in the world, threw off their supplies and simply left the mountain. The side effect of this, however, was that Mallory had to erect the tents for Camp 5 at 7,681 metres by himself, while Bruce and the other porter retrieved what the others had dropped. Their summit attempt would be completely called off when 3 more porters decided that they would be going no further up the mountain either, and so they all had to turn back before managing to erect Camp 6 at 8,170 metres. On their way back to camp, they would bump into Howard Somerville and Edward Norton. They were just beginning their own attempt. They had left an hour late, and were somewhat surprised to see the 2 men returning so quickly. When they heard what had happened, they began to get fearful that several of their own porters would give up too. And 2 did. But regardless, they had enough to press on, managing to reach a new climbing record, 8,572.8 metres, before they too could go no further. This is roughly where this photo was taken, showing Norton near his highest point on the mountain. They would manage to make it roughly just 200 to 300 metres below the summit. They would make it safely back to Camp 4 unharmed, except for the part where Somerville had to cough up part of his throat that he was choking on. Whether this happened as a result of the conditions on the mountain or just some random chance, I have no idea, and the thought of googling several throat conditions to find out why doesn't exactly fill me with excitement. Either way, they made it back in one piece, and then it was time for Mallory and Irvine's attempt. They were going to make use of bottled oxygen, seeing as Norton had managed to reach just below the summit without it. Hopes were high that, with it, a successful summit would maybe be possible. So they left Camp 5 at 8:40 AM on the 6th of June 1924. They would take one final picture of both of them before they set off. This would be the last picture of them alive. They would disappear with 8 porters up the mountain. The 8 would return. The last conclusive sighting of Mallory and Irvine, however, came at the hands of Noel Odell. He was climbing back up to Camp 6 when he saw the 2 men, well, 2 dots, high up in the mountain, one moving slowly towards the other. And what he guessed was the first or second steps. This sighting would be the last of the two men. They would never return from their attempt. Later, when no sign of the two was forthcoming to the other members of the expedition, a rescue party simply went to Camp 6 and waited. And waited, and waited. When none of them appeared, they simply laid 6 sleeping bags on a cross and went back down the mountain. They were both presumed dead. The expedition had set new world records in terms of height. Records that wouldn't be broken for another 28 years. But with 2 of the men not returning, and no summit having been reached, the 1924 Everest expedition could be seen as nothing but a complete failure. Their disappearance had raised several questions, though. What had happened to them? Did they actually reach the summit before succumbing to the mountain? If they didn't, then how high did they actually manage to reach? Controversy would abound after the expedition about what had actually happened. Immediately afterwards, a large section of the climbing community had believed that as Odell had seen them climbing over the second step, the most difficult of the 3 steps before the summit, that the mountain must have been conquered. Many people had thought that the second step was insurmountable though. Especially in the 5 minutes or so Odell had seen the 2 men climb over it. But if they had managed to get above it, then the 3rd step and the subsequent climb to the summit would be relatively easy, especially for Mallory, who was probably the most experienced Everest mountaineer in the world at this point. Odell, until the day he died, would never be fully sure on where exactly he saw those 2 dots that day. A bottle of oxygen from the 2 men would eventually be found in 1999, showing without a doubt that they had reached at least the bottom of the 1st step. Mallory's body would be found at 8,156 meters, with injuries to his head and around his waist. The 2 men had been roped together when the fatal accident seemingly happened, and Mallory's right foot had been almost completely broken off. If he had managed to survive the fall, he had no hope of even walking, never mind making it back down the mountain. That's even if he was conscious after the fall, so bad were his head injuries. Irvine would be found almost 7,000 feet lower, in the central Rongbuk Glacier, or at least a sign of him. A single sock with A.C. Irvine written on it, a boot and a foot was all that was left of them. But the 2 men, or at least some of them having been found, all that was left to answer was whether they had actually reached the summit. On the body of Mallory, there was no picture of his wife. This was strange. It had been in his pocket all expedition long, and he was certain that he was going to place it on the summit when he eventually reached it. In the end, the only real way of proving conclusively if the men had reached the top would be if they could find their camera. But this proved to be the one elusive object when both men's bodies were found. The first confirmed summit of Mount Everest would be by Edmund and Tenzing Norgay on the 29th of May 1953. It would take almost 30 years to finish the final couple hundred meters. And although climbing Everest today might still be somewhat of a challenge, back in the early 20th century, it's hard not to see many of these men as completely superhuman. Not just in their abilities on the exact same mountain, but also their incredible mentality and perseverance. May all those who lost their lives on Everest rest in peace.